Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 42 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. I'm really excited to be back this week with a brand new show, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Vicki Jay as my guest. Vicki is the CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children, and I think it's really timely that we're talking to her this week because Children's Grief Awareness Month starts on Friday, on November 1st. So if you're listening, on Wednesday or Thursday here, be on the lookout for that in a few days. Lots of hashtags across lots of platforms with content for Children's Grief Awareness Month. In the meantime, Vicki and I talked about a lot of really interesting things. One point she made that I think was a really good one is the fact that it's much easier to address childhood grief early in a child's life than it is to deal with the potential effects of unresolved grief down the road later when they become adults. So be listening for that. Also, a really interesting statistic, which I'll be following up more in detail in probably next week's interview with Judy's House, but about the fact that 1 in 14 kids will lose a parent or sibling by the age of 18. So be listening for that and look for more on that particular piece next week. Also, we talked quite a bit about Children's Grief Awareness Month and some ways that widowed parents can get involved to help raise awareness, and including they have an Everyday Heroes campaign that they're doing this month, and encouraging people to submit stories of people who have been heroes in their communities or, when their families and they're working with their children, with grieving children. So be looking for a link in the show notes for that. Also, why we should all wear blue on November 21st, which is Children's Grief Awareness Day within the greater month. And post pictures for sure on social media with the appropriate hashtags, of course. Vicki also talked about the activity book for elementary age kids and their caregivers that the NAGC has put together. It's a really neat book, so if you have kids in that age group, I'd encourage you to take a look at that, and it is available in both English and Spanish on Amazon. Links in the show notes to that as well. And also, last year's campaign, I think, is worth looking at. They did it, it's called Dear Me, and it's letters from adults who lost a parent when they were young to their younger selves. And I think that's a really important perspective for widowed parents to consider. And so Vicki and I talked about that as well. And the resources they have on their website, including if you're looking for grief resources in your local area, they have a state-by-state listing, also a nationwide listing of programs that are not location-specific that you might want to take a look at, and also a listing in Canada of resources as well. So with that, I hope you enjoy my discussion with Vicki Jay. My guest today is Vicki Jay, who's joining us from her office in Texas. Vicki is the CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children. She was also the founding director of the Rays of Hope Children's Grief Center in Midland, Texas, and had a 19-year career with hospice before taking on her current role with NAGC. Vicki is recognized for her role in children's advocacy and has received many awards for her work with nonprofits and in the field of bereavement, including the National Jefferson Award for Community Service. Vicki, it's so great to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I am so honored and privileged to be here today.
Oh yeah, well I'm really glad to be talking with you, and especially today on the eve of Children's Grief Awareness Month, which we will get more into in a few minutes here. But first of all, can you tell us what is the National Alliance for Grieving Children, and what do you guys do?
The National Alliance for Grieving Children, and Jenny, just to be honest, sometimes we say NAGC just because it's faster, so I may do that throughout our conversation today.
Perfect.
Is an organization that was developed especially in honor of bereaved children. It's a network of professionals who want to support anybody who is supporting a grieving child.
Aha. Okay, so it is an organization. The membership primarily then is not, for example, widowed parents. The membership is primarily those who serve widowed parents, grieving children, people in that space.
Right. But our goal is to equip anybody who interacts with the grieving child. So that would be parents, bereaved parents, widowed parents, as well as school counselors, school teachers, anybody who has that opportunity to offer some kind of support to a child who's experienced a death.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. So how long have you guys been around? How did you get started? Can you give us a little bit of history?
Absolutely. We came together really before children's bereavement was a field. It wasn't necessarily recognized as a professional field, but we realized that kids needed support. So people who were trying to offer those services decided to come together, network, and decide what are best practices. How do we go about doing this and making sure that we're honoring our kids in the best way possible? So we are celebrating our 25th anniversary next year in 2021, of coming together as professionals trying to determine the best ways to serve kids. It really started, anybody can offer grief services to kids, but it's not necessarily governed by a governing body. And so we decided we needed to form best practices. And that's what brought everybody together, to share research and programs and just kind of resources. Yeah,
that's fantastic. And I know from my experience, and I think a lot of my listeners would agree, that it is obviously such an important field to us. So I'm very glad to be able to ask you some questions today and learn more about this.
Absolutely.
But I guess before that, how did you get involved in this line of work?
So my background is in education. I was a classroom teacher and administrator and have a love of kids. And it's very apparent when you work with kids in any format that when they have a loss in their life, it definitely affects the way they behave, the way they perform academically. So I was able to connect with a local hospice who had a bereavement program for adults. And together we developed some programming for kids. So it started obviously with kids of hospice parents, patients, not all parents, sometimes it was grandparents. And it grew into something much larger because the need was definitely there. Along the way of trying to establish that program is how I got it connected to NAGC. I was looking for resources, came to NAGC many years ago as a program provider. Then was able to serve on their board, and actually was on the board the year we hired our first CEO. So that was pretty exciting. And then once I finished my board term, I left the field for a while and just recently have come back as the CEO at NAGC.
Exciting. Awesome.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So maybe this is a philosophical question. I don't know, but why do you think that children's grief is such an important topic? Why is it, why is the NAGC and people come together to focus on this as a field to establish?
First of all, grief is universal. There is not a person that is not going to experience grief. So it's not whether or not you've had the experience, it's what you've been allowed to do about it, how you've been able to handle it. So it's my belief that the earlier we can provide support for anybody who's had a loss, then the healthier adult that person is. It's much easier to support a grieving child than it is to, heal a broken adult, for instance. So I think the whole field came out of, we need to support these kids while they're kids to help them have a healthy journey rather than maybe a not so healthy journey. What's really happened is that we ignore kids. We don't want to think about them as being grievers. A long time ago, they were described, Kubler-Ross and others have described them as forgotten mourners. And it's maybe not that they're forgotten, it's that we don't know what to do about it. We want to think they're resilient, and it's just easier to know that they're kids and they'll bounce back than it has been to do something about it. So the care and support really fell to the parents and families of those kids, and yet typically they were also grieving. So it's very hard for a bereaved parent to support a bereaved child. So the field kind of developed from, we need a neutral group to come in and support both parties independently so that they can have their own grief journeys. Does that make sense?
It does. And those are such important points. And I would add, I think, one more challenge, because it's interesting you mentioned it fell to the parents themselves to support their own children. And they're grieving themselves, so that makes it hard. And generally, those parents are not experts themselves in grief or mental health or childhood development or, right? And that makes it extra hard too. When you maybe my kid needs help, but I don't know what they need, or I don't know where to begin.
And a child's grief journey looks very different than an adult grief journey. We all look different. And then you have, let's say, a bereaved parent who doesn't have the energy to get up off the couch to face their own day, much less support a angry teenager, for instance. You know, so even though they may have experienced the same loss at the same time, the relationship to the deceased is different, and where they are in their grief journey is also very, very different. So it's very hard for them to, have the wherewithal, and then on top of it, as you said, the skills and knowledge to be able to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So well articulated, I think, as to what the problem is. And one other thing you said that I want to just repeat here, because I think it was fascinating, that it's so much easier to support a grieving child while they're grieving in those earlier stages than it is to address the effects of that down the road if something goes wrong.
Absolutely. Grief is a very normal and natural process if we let it be. But sometimes we don't let it be. And so by ignoring it, not addressing it, it takes other forms. And we want to make sure that we get ahead of that, and that we, are able to support kids at the moment that they've had the crisis and the loss throughout their own journey, no matter how long that lasts, rather than waiting till the effects show up later in life. If you read a lot of the statistics and a lot of the events that happen in our world, there's a lot of unresolved grief that has had a negative effect on people and on communities. And we certainly don't want that to be the case.
Yeah.
Our kids are going to experience death. There's some statistics currently from Judy's House. They have done a CBIM study that is fascinating. And they say 1 in 14 kids will experience a loss of a parent or a sibling before they graduate high school. So
wait, let me just 1 in 14 kids before they finish high school will experience a very, very close loss, a parent or a sibling.
Right. Not just a loss, but a parent or a sibling loss.
Yeah.
So that, I'm a classroom teacher. So when I convert that to a classroom, that means in a classroom of 28 kids, for instance, there's going to be 2 kids in that graduating class that lose a parent or a sibling. So it's huge, and it affects our overall health, not just the health of those 2 individuals and their families and loved ones and the people that are affected. It affects how they become an adult and interact with our world. So it's a health issue. I mean, it's a big deal that we really need to recognize. Number 1, kids do grieve, and number 2, we're going to do something about it.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I just, you mentioned that statistic, and it's got me thinking. Both of my kids now have had 3 people in their class have had parents die, which I guess that's over the statistic. But I mean, I think that's kind of crazy and terrible and unbelievable, actually. That's each, my kid and then 2 classmates, 3 of them have each had a parent die, and they're not even to 18 yet, right? They're younger than that.
Right. It happens. And so for years and years, we've known that happens, but we didn't know that it affected kids in the way it did. So our issue, and we try to protect kids. So many times it's not out of our negligence or lack of skills. It's really just, out of our comfort zone. We try to protect our kids. We don't want our kids to hurt. So it's easier to not talk about things that are hard than it is to bring up hard subjects. So one of the things that I would say to many of your audience is, hats off to you if you're willing to embrace the conversations with your kids and talk about death and dying and the effects thereof, because that's what our kids need. They need to be included, and they need to learn about it. My background is with early childhood, and from the beginning, we protect kids when something dies. The goldfish died in my classroom.
Mm.
What did I do? I flushed and replaced ASAP.
Uh-huh.
And I told people that was to protect my kids because I didn't want them to hurt.
Right.
In reality, I missed an opportunity to talk about death and dying in its most natural form.
Right. In a very low stakes kind of way.
In a low stakes kind of way. And it wasn't about protecting my kids. It was about protecting Vicki. Because I was a chicken to have that conversation. So I would just encourage your audience, don't be afraid of those conversations. Kids are natural, curious, and they want to know and want to be included, and they handle things much better. The more open we are about it, the more open they understand, and they develop a healthy attitude towards it.
Yeah. Okay. And so this has got me thinking now, because what am I trying to say? I think that's such an important point, and it would be helpful if we can get that message out to more people, because if, honestly, if you haven't spent any time thinking about having someone close to you die, you might not have thought about what's the best way to talk to kids about it until something happens, and then you're scrambling. I guess what I'm leading to is we have an opportunity this coming up here in November to raise awareness of children's grief. It is, as you, of course, know, Children's Grief Awareness Month. What do you think are some ways that widowed parents maybe can help raise awareness of this issue during November?
Jenny, that's why our Awareness Month exists, is because we all need to work hard to raise that awareness that kids do grieve and they need our support. And nobody knows that better than your audience. Mm-hmm. Those widowed parents have such a burden to bear in their own grief, and then to support kids. And so the more they can share their own journey and their journey of their kids with others, to let people know that kids grieve. As you said, your kids in your classroom or in their classmates have had losses. And so to use whatever opportunities there are in your personal worlds to talk about death and dying, and to discuss it, and to embrace kids into the conversation and involve them. There's a lot of ways. NAGC has kind of a campaign going on.
I'd love to hear. Yeah, I'd love to hear about the campaign. What do you guys have planned?
So, it's kind of a marketing campaign, if you will. So what we want to do is identify heroes. And heroes are people who do extraordinary things for extraordinary ways for everyday people. And so we're talking about our everyday heroes. And those are people that have supported a grieving child, who are willing to do something to support a grieving child, who recognize the need. So, wearing T-shirts that say "Children Grieve" and being a superhero. In your classrooms, when a child dies, has somebody they know die, as a classroom, do something for that family. Involve your kids in it. Rather than you taking food, let your kids bake the cookies to take food there. Involve kids in all your discussion and in all the activities. Go to your local grief centers. We have grief centers. The NAGC is a network of grief centers across the U.S. also. So we have grief centers in every state. You can go on our website and click on the state and see what all programs there are to support grieving children. Offer to volunteer, offer, some financial resources. Just do things that in your own community raise that awareness. We have a webcast in the fall, in November, that is specifically offered for communities to host and then bring their community together. And there's nobody better to lead that charge than a widowed parent, to say, help us as we help our kids. Let's all increase our understanding of what our kids need through this process. Mm-hmm. I could go on and on. We have all kinds of great tools, but you can go on the website. There's tips on how to help a grieving child, how to, for one child to help another child. So how a student, your kids, for instance, could be a hero to one of those other kids in their classroom whose parent or sibling had died. So we're just trying to get education out on how do you support a grieving child.
Yeah. And in terms of social media specifically for November, because one of the things that I'm planning to do a bunch of awareness on social media, and it'd be awesome if listeners would as well and try to help amplify that message. November 21st, I think, is the day to wear blue. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, a long time ago, Highmark Caring Center identified November 21st. It's always the Thursday prior to Thanksgiving Thursday, in a specific day to recognize children's grief. So it's wearing blue as a symbol. You know how colors have kind of become a way of us recognizing different efforts. And so that's our color, if you will. But it didn't take but a year or two for us to recognize that it's more than a day. We needed a month because there's just a lot of information and education that needs to be out there. So we're asking people for the whole month of November to, pay attention to social media. There's all kinds of people, including yourself, Jenny, that will be posting things and blogs and articles and share and, just keep hashtagging and pushing things forward so that everybody has the opportunity to read and learn about children's grief.
Yeah. Okay. And if everybody who's listening here can wear blue on the 21st and post a picture on social media with appropriate hashtags, that would be awesome, because we can really, I think, make a show out there to raise awareness.
But I would add, take a picture of it and post a picture of you wearing blue on social media so that we continue to know and see the efforts that are being made to support,
yes.
kids.
And the hashtags are what?
Hashtag children's grieve and hashtag everyday hero.
Okay.
We're also asking communities and people to identify, so your widowed parents, for instance, who's been a hero to them? Who's really helped them through the process, through their own process, as well as the process with their kids? And so maybe it was that teacher or counselor or soccer coach. Maybe it's a Sunday school teacher, somebody who's helped kind of support that child. Recognize them through social media, through your community efforts, and say, I want to recognize this person as an everyday hero to grieving children because this is my story and this is what they did for me and my child.
Yeah.
And that would be a great way for them to get involved in the effort.
I love that. And I think you also have, if they want to take an extra step and submit a story, a write-up of that situation,
Absolutely.
That person who's helped to you guys, and then you guys can publicize that on your social media as well.
Absolutely. It'll be on our website and we're pushing them out. We actually just got a story recently and we're able to turn it into a comic strip. And so that too will be floating. So send us your content and we'll see what creative ways we can help push it back out. And then pay attention during that month because you may see some of your own stuff floating around.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. I'll put a link in the show notes for sure so that people can find that easily.
Okay.
And then I think, are you also going to have a Facebook profile frame like you had, I think, last year where people can have that up just for the month?
We do. We have a Facebook profile that you can use. It's real easy to do. So that'll be on our website, and I'll give you the website in a minute. And you can tag yourself through that process. We also have T-shirts for sale. They're not benefiting us. You order them directly from the T-shirt company. And then that helps spread it through the people that have the opportunity to visually see you during that month.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, great. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing this all over social media here next month.
Thank you.
So let's go back a little bit more to the resources at NAGC. So you talked about how parents can go to your website, and you have a link where you can look by state and see all the programs that might be local, which I think is a fantastic resource because sometimes it is hard to know where to start. So I think that's a really good starting point. And then I think you also have a nationwide listing because some programs aren't necessarily place specific, right? Can you tell us about what else you have there?
There's some nationwide resources that offer things. For instance, there's Eluna, which is a camp organization. So they have camps everywhere. Formerly, it was Moyer camps. And you can click on that and find out where across the nation they're offering camps. We're also partnered with TAPS for military families. And there's just a lot of resources listed there. In addition, we have some past webinars that you can, view as a member. Our membership is very nominal for the resources that you get. Some of our resources are open to the public and some are behind the member site. We also have tip sheets like, how do you have a hard conversation with the child? How do you involve a child in a funeral? How do you, explain this horrific event that's just happened in our world to a child? Many times bereaved parents and your widowed audience people will turn to them and say, what did you do, and what helped you and what didn't help you? And so we tried to take what we've learned from widowed parents and others who've experienced loss and put it in a format to pass the information forward so that others will have the tools and be equipped to better support kids.
Yeah.
So
that's fantastic.
All of those kind of things. Yeah.
I love that. And then you also have an activity book. I think it's called When Someone Dies. Can you tell us a little bit about who that's for and what that's all about?
I'm so proud of that activity book because it's not authored by a single person. It's not one point of view. It's authored by our members across the U.S. So different members contributed on the content, on what should be content, and then the activities that are included. And it's a book that is specifically for elementary age kids and intended to be used in conjunction with conversations with a caregiver. So it's kind of a workbook. It has a great activity, a hands-on activity for a child to use. But on the side of each page is a list of tips for the caregiver, how to have this conversation, how to explain it to them, how to, make the most of this conversation you're having. So it's kind of we put the topic on the table through the book. A perfect example is there is a page with a lot of funeral-related items on there. So there's a casket and an urn and a headstone and a hearse and all those things that aren't normally in kids' books. You don't really have the opportunity to have that discussion until, perhaps it's a very personal time.
Right.
So we want to make sure that kids understand all those symbols and all those things that happen. Another page, it might just be about the feelings that they're having about the person or the loss or the death or the future or whatever. So it's just a great activity book that engages a parent or caregiver and a child in conversation about difficult things related to grief.
Yeah. And I have to say, I love those sidebars with the information for the adults. And it's real small print. It's not, the kid's not going to be like, what's all this stuff? But I think, like you said, that providing that additional context and advice and tips for the adult who then is involved with the child. It's not just like, here, kid, here's this book, go draw these pictures. Right. But it's got that fuller picture included. Well,
and we have gotten so much feedback because people are very appreciative of the help, the tips that help. You can order the book on Amazon, or you can order in bulk through us. But what's so exciting is so many of our orders have come from people who used it, who now want to gift it to somebody else. So they found it so helpful, they're ready. And that means a lot to me. That, when you find a resource and you want to pass it on, that's a pretty good compliment.
That's awesome. And I think, is it available in Spanish as well as English?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Yes.
Awesome. Okay, good. Well, I'll put links in the show notes to both of those versions on Amazon.
Okay. Awesome.
And then, like you said, if somebody does want to order in bulk from your website as well. When we were talking before about the listings on the website by state and nationwide, and I think there's also a list of resources in Canada, right?
There are, and we have some in Canada, and we're actually right on the brink of developing a further relationship with a network very similar to the NAGC that has just started in Canada. And they're mimicking or want to mimic what we've done here in the States. So
nice.
Yes.
Well, and I actually have quite a few listeners in Canada and the UK and Australia.
Cool.
So I'm glad to know that you have those Canadian resources listed there too.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. And then I wanted to also ask you, so this year's campaign you're talking about is the Everyday Heroes feature, but last year's campaign I think was also really interesting. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, we did a Dear Me campaign. Christopher Reeve's son, Will, is one of our board members. And he wrote a letter to
Christopher Reeve being Superman, right?
Superman, yeah.
Yes.
So he wrote a letter to his younger self. So as an adult, what would you say to yourself back when you had the loss, when the death occurred or the aftermath thereof? So we had kind of a campaign, a Dear Me video campaign, where we asked people, what would you say to your younger self? And so on our website, you can see several of those Dear Me letters and Dear Me videos where people have kind of reflected back and mentioned the lessons learned. And, if I knew now what I know now, how cool that would be. So I would encourage anybody to read those or listen to the ones that are on the list.
I love that. And I think, I also interview, one of the kind of categories of interviews I do is people who are now adults, but they lost a parent when they were young. And as a widowed parent, I find it really interesting and helpful to hear that perspective, because like you were saying before, my kids and I might have both lost the same person, but we have very different relationship to that person and just a whole different situation. And I think that, it's hard for me necessarily to understand my kids' perspective, losing a different relationship. And so I think that hearing, reading those Dear Me letters and the interviews that I've done, I find it so, it's not like talking to these people is going to tell me exactly what my kids are going through, but it gives me a lot to think about in a perspective that maybe I didn't have before. And I think that your Dear Me letters are along the same lines. So I would really encourage people to go take a look at those. I think it's really it's a window that we don't always get to see, I think, into someone's experience.
One of the main differences about adult grief and kids' grief is that, we're an adult, and so we act and process and behave and listen and learn as an adult. But kids go through developmental changes throughout childhood. And so the grief is different at every different developmental age. And those letters reflect a lot of that, that you've grown up through your grief. It didn't just happen and you handled it. You've changed and your grief journey has changed. And I think those stories really reflect that.
Yeah.
A lot.
I'll put the link to that in the show notes as well.
Okay.
And I would really encourage people to take a look at those, the videos, like you said, and the written stories, because I do think it's a really good perspective to try to take a look at. Okay, let's see. We're getting towards the end of our time. A couple more questions here. I guess what do you think are some of the most frequent questions you hear from widowed parents? What do you think widowed parents are most concerned about? Like from where you sit, what are you hearing as the biggest questions or challenges?
I think as parents, their concern is, did I do everything I could? I don't want to mess up. I'm afraid I didn't say or do it right. How do I help my child through this process? All those questions that we ask ourselves as parents all the time. But when you add the bereavement part on top of it, that your kids have had this extraordinary experience that many kids don't have, I think it's always, how can I be sure I'm doing the best for my kid? And, what I would say is there is no best. There is no right or wrong way to do this. There's no right or wrong way to do it for yourself and or for your kids. And then the other thing is, people want to say, when will I be done? When will I know we're all okay? When will I be able to sit back and say, okay, we survived that and we're all okay? And, it's not something you can check done ever. It's something that forms who you are going forward. So there'll always be marks and scars, but there's always celebrations also. So just to know that this is help develop the person you are and the person your child has become, and you've done everything you can in the best way you can, then you've done it right. That's so a lot of our questions are on assurances, just am I okay? We get a lot of questions that are probably kind of past tense for your audience, and that is, do you take a child to a funeral? How much do you tell them about the illness or the accident or the death? How do you talk about a child about suicide? So we have a lot of those in the moment questions. Mm-hmm. But the bigger picture is, I just want to make sure I'm doing it right.
Yeah.
And the best gift you can give your kid is to love them through it and to know that you'll never check it done. Because if your loss happened when your child was 5, they're going to ask 5-year-old questions, and they're going to get 5-year-old answers, and they're going to process it like a 5-year-old. But when they hit adolescence, when they hit young adulthood, when they start their own relationships, they're going to have new questions. They need new answers, and they're going to process it with the new person that they've become. Mm-hmm. So just support them through all of that. Does that make sense, Jenny?
It does. Yeah. I think that's really fantastic. And I think you've also answered what was going to be my next question, which was if you could say one thing to widowed parents, what would that be? I think you've covered that, unless you'd like to add anything.
The only thing I would say is to forgive yourself. Don't worry about whether you did it right or wrong. Whatever has happened has happened, whatever you've said, whatever support you've given or not given. But just go forward and love each other through it. Love your kids into their adulthood and beyond.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think that is the perfect place to end. So my guest today is Vicki Jay, who is the CEO of the National Alliance for Grieving Children. So Vicki, where can listeners find you and find the NAGC if they would like to learn more about your work? Okay.
We are the National Alliance for Grieving Children, but our website is actually www.childrengrieve.org.
Okay.
And so you can find us on Facebook and on our website using the term Children Grieve.
Okay. Well, fantastic. Vicki, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you, Jenny.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Vicki Jay as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 42. And hey, just a few remarks. Lots of exciting things going on this week. November 1st is Friday, is the beginning of Children's Grief Awareness Month. So be looking for lots and lots of activity then. I'm going to be sharing some content from other folks that I think you might be interested in hearing about, plus sharing my own stuff as well. And I will have a brand new guide for allies. Those are the friends and family, colleagues, neighbors of widowed parents. People are always asking me how they can better support the widowed parents in their circles. So I've put together some information to share with them. So be looking for that next week. And also I will be kicking off on Friday, being November 1st, kicking off the month with some exciting news. I can't share it now, but do be looking for that announcement on Friday, or that item, actually. And what else? Let's see. There's some hashtags you could follow along. Hashtag Children Grieve, and hashtag Everyday Hero, and hashtag CGAD Hope. That's Children's Grief Awareness Day Hope, CGAD Hope. Bunch of different people working in the children's grief space will be using those hashtags throughout the month across Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and maybe LinkedIn too. I know I'll be sharing there as well. So if we're not connected in those places, please look me up. I'm at Lisk Jenny on all those places, except for LinkedIn is a little different. I'll put the link to that in the show notes. Anyway, I think that is all. Also, be thinking about, for Children's Grief Awareness Month, it would be awesome if you have a favorite episode, or even 2 or 3, and consider sharing those out on social media. I think it helps raise awareness of children's grief, and hopefully get this resource into the hands of more people who would like to listen to it. So that is all for now. Thanks for listening. Until next week, keep smiling.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.